Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. If you can take your seats, thank you. My name is Jacqueline Coté. I'm the Director of Public Relations here at the Graduate Institute, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you this afternoon to this event, which we organize in partnership with the Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights and the journal The Guardian. Thank you to both for having made this event possible for us. And I would also like to thank our distinguished panel, and Ed Pilkington, our moderator, will introduce the panelists in a short while. Before I give the word to our speakers, I would like to mention that Philip Alston, the Special Rapporteur, as you know, presented his report on the 23rd of June. That was last Thursday. And we take it as a strong sign that the Council is actually taking a global view of its mandate and about tackling human rights violation and about economic and social and cultural rights also in the West. But a few days before the launch, no doubt you read that the US withdrew from the Human Rights Council. That was a warning. Nikki Haley in this very room last year mentioned that as a possibility. So speaking outside the Council, of course, Ambassador Haley said that the report was, in her words, misleading and politically motivated. And that has stirred quite a lot of articles in the press ever since. But by bringing here today Professor Alston and a number of leading non-governmental actors, it is our hope that we can have a discussion about the in-depth issues of the report away from political discourse. And it is really the mission of the Graduate Institute to allow us to have these type of conversation, and one that we carry every day in an impartial and neutral manner. So with this, I would like to now give the floor to the word to Ed, who will introduce the speakers. Thank you very much.
Hi. Thank you very much for coming to this discussion about poverty and inequality in America and human rights under threat in the age of Trump. And thank you for those who are listening in through live streaming. And thank you so much to the Graduate Institute for this incredible venue in Geneva, which is just over the road from the United Nations complex, so very appropriate. My name's Ed Pilkington. I'm the chief reporter in the US for The Guardian. And it's my great privilege to be here at the end of the process of the UN Special Rapporteur's investigation into extreme poverty and human rights in America. It's a privilege for me personally because I've been pretty much every step along the way tracking this process from the very beginning, about 6 months ago, through the tour that happened in December and until last week's events in front of an empty chair at the Human Rights Council with the US government absent. And in that time, I've reflected on what is this process all about. And I think for me, it all became clear last week with Nikki Haley's response, Nikki Haley being the US ambassador to the United Nations, her response to the report by the Special Rapporteur, in which she said it was patently ridiculous for the United Nations to be taking any interest in poverty in America. And for me, that crystallized the whole issue. This is about accountability. It's about the fact that no country, however powerful, however rich, is above scrutiny when it comes to the way that 40 million people living in America are doing so in poverty, 18 million in conditions that are virtually destitute. So our panel here today are all in very different ways, which is one reason I think it's a very exciting discussion that's about to happen. In very different ways, they're all pioneers of accountability, of precisely that, of holding governments and the powerful to account for the way that they respond to standards of basic human rights and human dignity. On my left is Philip Alston, so he is the reason why we're here. He is the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. And it is him who I've been kind of tracking for the last 6 months journalistically. He delivered his report last week to the Human Rights Council. He's a New York University international law professor. But for me, as a journalist, what distinguishes him is that he speaks in plain language and in strong terms about issues that he thinks need to be addressed, particularly in America in this instance. To his left, the Reverend Liz Theoharis. It's a miracle that you're even here with us, Liz. We've been joking about her not being very busy recently. She's just finished a 40-day epic journey across America, campaigning in what she calls a moral revival, in the spirit of Martin Luther King, trying to pick up what Dr. King had just started when he was assassinated, the idea of a sort of popular mobilization to campaign around issues of poverty. And 10 days ago, you were yourself arrested on the steps of the United States Supreme Court, protesting the new Supreme Court ruling, which allows states to purge from their voter rolls people because they haven't voted recently, which is one of the interesting things that's been happening stateside in recent weeks. To Liz's left, Ken Roth began 30 years ago in a small New York office with 20, I think I'm right, 20 lawyers with the idea, why don't we try and shame governments and powerful people who are breaching human rights law. Today, that team is now almost 500 strong in 49 countries, and he's executive director of Human Rights Watch, which needs no introduction. He also has an incredible Twitter feed, which I recommend to anybody who needs an antidote to that other Twitter feed, which will remain nameless. Finally, Catherine Flowers, on my far left, will bring the discussion down to earth and to a local level. Catherine is an amazing campaigner and activist in the deep south of Alabama with the Equal Justice Initiative and the Center for Earth Ethics. She's done incredible work, which I've reported on myself, so I know how great it is, exposing diseases of poverty and other human impacts when poverty becomes an issue that is affecting people's lives. And I'm looking forward to hearing Catherine talking about precisely that, how individual human lives are impacted by all this. I'm going to begin with a question to each person individually, just so we can locate their position in this discussion. And then I'm going to start throwing out questions to the entire panel, and I'm hoping we'll have a lively discussion. I'm thinking we'll go about an hour, and then we'll have about half an hour for people to ask questions after that. So, beginning with you, Philip. You've kind of, well, I have two mixed metaphors, either cat among the pigeons or a hornet's nest. You could sort of take whichever one you like, but either way, it's been pretty extraordinary seeing what's happened in the last few days. One of the things that Nikki Haley said about you was that your report was misleading, which I think is an interesting word for a senior person of the Trump administration to use, bearing in mind that misleading seems to be a catchword for them. But just to take a few points that she and the official report that came out a couple of days later said about your report. So here's a fact, or it's supposedly a fact. You say 18 million people in your report live in extreme poverty. They say 250,000. That's a pretty extraordinary gap. You say that no government, even if they deny such rights, is able to be negligent over not dying from hunger, the right of not dying from hunger, or the right of not having access to healthcare. They say that economic and social rights equals the right of property and the right to make your own livelihood. Again, another vast gulf. They're almost two entirely separate worlds. On a more perhaps substantive point, people have questioned whether the use of your data going back to 2016, which was obviously Obama's era, is being unfairly directed towards the Trump administration, and that a lot of what you write about is actually decades old. So just to fling out some of those issues and to put it into one pithy sentence, is your report fake news?
Well, you've really put the cat among the hornet's nest or whatever it is. Let me just say, by way of introduction, that none of us wants to have a stalker, but if the stalker is Ed Pilkington and he's following this story around for a long time, it's a very rewarding exercise. It's hard to know where to begin in terms of the administration's response on these issues. I think it is very important that they have shown through their comments recently that they more or less don't acknowledge the existence of poverty in the United States. The phrase that they use in the official report is taken almost directly from an analysis by the Heritage Foundation. But nonetheless, the implication of that is that instead of there being 40 million people living in poverty or 18.5 living in extreme poverty, it's a handful. And of course, that's the very worst starting point in terms of ever being able to address issues. Denial is not a productive way to begin. I think it's also revealing, as you say, the right to earn one's own livelihood and the right to private property are the economic rights. But of course, what this report is all about is that government has a huge role in any economy. This government is redistributing wealth at a speed that no other government has ever done, but it's being redistributed to the very top of the tree. Meanwhile, there is a denial that there's any serious role that government needs to play for those who are at the bottom.
And Liz, picking up what Philip just said about the administration thinking there's just a handful of poor people in America, which is a slight exaggeration, but the figure 250,000 is going in that direction. You've just done this epic tour through the country, 40 different states. For Nikki Haley's benefit primarily, what did you see? Can you tell her anything different?
So it's great to be here, and thank you to Philip Alston for this, for actually paying attention to poverty in the U.S. and being willing to showcase that. I've been doing anti-poverty organizing for about 25 years of my life amongst the homeless, amongst low-wage workers, and you know, this is a moment when we can get a little bit of attention about a reality that has been, you know, growing surely, and things are on steroids these days, but it's been an epidemic in our country for a long, long time with very little attention. And so right, I just came off of 40 days of nonviolent moral fusion direct action in 40 states across the country for 40 days. Poor people and others were engaging in direct organizing and door-knocking education and nonviolent civil disobedience. And we've had thousands of people over the course of the last 6 weeks be arrested trying to pull attention to the crisis of poverty. And you know, in the lead up to that and during those 40 days, I've been traveling for many years all around the country to many of the poorest parts of the United States. And you know, in Aberdeen, Washington, there's in a town of 16,000, 1,000 of those young people are homeless, living in 10 cities. And these are predominantly white millennials who the lumber industry left, and there's been no economy since. Or Detroit, Michigan, where literally, as we speak, there are hundreds of thousands, like about 100,000 households that don't have running water. And what happens in Detroit when you don't have water is that if a kid goes to school and tells a teacher that they don't have water in their house, that teacher is required to tell the authorities, and that kid will be removed from their home. There's no supports, there's no help. These are some of the highest water rates in the country, and kids are being snatched out of their homes, put into warehouses, sound familiar? And separated from their families. And this is next to one of the largest fresh bodies of water in the whole world. This is a body of water that the Nestle Corporation can bottle as much as they want for about $1, $2, $5 a year and make billions in profit. But babies are being snatched from their homes because they don't have water in a very, very wealthy country. In fact, there are 14 million people in the United States right now who most likely can't afford their water bills. And so, Nikki Haley, your state of South Carolina has 2.1 million poor people in it. The majority of those are poor white people. There's a disproportionate number of poor people of color in that state. And there are cesspools, there's a lack of sanitation, there's people working jobs that are paid virtually nothing, almost in indebted slavery, and this is in 2018. And so, and the stories could keep going, because these are people's lives. I mean, folks whose children die in their arms because they don't have health care. And in fact, if we're going to talk about this figure of 250,000, the Mailman School of Public Health at Columbia University actually says that about 250,000 people die from poverty in the United States every year.
Thank you for cheering us up. But seriously, but setting the parameters of this whole discussion. So Ken, I mean, everyone's familiar with Human Rights Watch, incredible work around the world. Shaming, I think, is the word you like to use. Shaming governments and the powerful when they violate human rights standards. I think people are less familiar, certainly I was, that your largest country team is in the United States. And a lot of the great work you do, The Guardian in America, we're constantly reporting on your brilliant US-based work. It's criminal justice, it's immigration, and national security. But for the purposes of this discussion, I wondered how you see Human Rights Watch role in economic and social rights. We just heard from Liz that, and we've read in Philip's report, that there are millions of people in America suffering. They don't have to be innocent in prison to be suffering. They're suffering because they don't have water. They're suffering because they may not have enough food to put on the table at the end of the month. So talk to me about that and how you see Human Rights Watch's role within that domestic debate.
I'll do that, Ed, but let me just begin maybe with a comment on Nikki Haley, then come to your question.
Sure, please.
You know, because when I listen to Nikki Haley's argument, which is basically the economy is growing, we're creating jobs, enough. You know, this could have been China. That's China's argument. You know, GDP is growing, got lots of jobs, so don't talk to us about, you know, these policies that we have that keep people impoverished, whether it's, you know, throwing Uyghurs into re-education or denying, you know, any ability to remedy environmental degradation. I mean, I could go on. I don't want to do the China thing too long, but it's the same argument. And so, you know, what it obviously neglects is what are the policies that aggravate poverty, that keep people in poverty. So there's this interesting parallel. Now, that gets to your question. Just for those who are not familiar with the obvious, the concept of human rights generally is divided into two parts. There's so-called civil and political rights, which deals with, you know, political freedoms and due process and things of that sort. And they're what is known as economic, social, and cultural rights, which for these purposes are basically the rights of the impoverished. You know, the rights to ensure the most basic levels of decency and humanity with respect to education, healthcare, housing, employment, etc. And so there's no question that all of these should be considered rights. The US, very ideologically, only considers the civil and political rights as rights. They have ratified that treaty, but they haven't ratified the separate treaty that recognizes these poverty rights. And so that's the ideological framework in which we operate. Now, Human Rights Watch comes at this really in two different ways. On the one hand, we attack frontally some of the denial of economic, social, and cultural rights. So just to give an example, the right to healthcare, which, you know, doesn't mean a right to be healthy, which would be ridiculous, but it does ensure a right to, you know, basic standards of healthcare, which the Trump administration is deliberately attacking by, for example, trying to get rid of Obamacare or declaring war on Planned Parenthood and the reproductive freedom and maternal health services that provides. So, you know, one consequence of that is that you have extraordinarily high rates of maternal mortality in the United States. You have extraordinarily high rates of cervical cancer in the United States as a direct product of the failure to provide basic, adequate health care to everybody. Now, there are many other dimensions to this problem that Human Rights Watch has been working on. There are many policies in the United States that basically prey upon the poor. And you can see this in everything from, certain criminal justice systems that instead of living through taxation as a basic, function of government, they fund themselves by imposing fees and penalties on the users, who of course are involuntary users, or the people who've been brought before there. And if you're poor, this can further impoverish you because you can't pay the fine, and these private companies then have the right to, enforce that fine at threat of imprisonment. You see another dimension of this with bail, where judges will set bail not by looking at what you can afford, but by just figuring, oh, this is a serious crime you've been accused of, we're going to set bail at such and such a rate, which if you're poor, you can't afford. Once you're in prison awaiting trial, you're much more likely to plead guilty, you're much more likely to then have the scars of this criminal conviction haunt you for the rest of your life, and it puts you into this cycle of poverty. And there are many other dimensions to this problem. And so Human Rights Watch really kind of focuses on both. We look at, direct violations of economic and social rights, but also these areas, particularly of criminal justice, which tend to reinforce the cycle of poverty.
Catherine, bring us down to earth, and I mean that almost literally. Take us to Lowndes County in Alabama, where you've done so much of your work, the county through which Martin Luther King marched from Montgomery to Selma. Was it the other way around? So, thank you. That you can talk human rights until the cows come home, but what does it mean to the people you work for and work with?
Well, first of all, thank you for this opportunity. I'm a native of Lowndes County, Alabama. Lowndes County is the area where most of the Selma to Montgomery March Trail goes through. It is also where a lot of people who came in through Montgomery, which was one of the largest slave trading ports in the United States, and recently was acknowledged with the opening of a museum and lynching memorial by the Equal Justice Initiative, who I also work for. A lot of the descendants of that slave trade, when you said property, that's what popped in my mind. Everybody that was enslaved had a job. However, there were a lot of rights that they were denied, especially economic rights. And the people in Lowndes County, we are largely descendants of those slaves that were brought in to work the soil. So what I see in Lowndes County are a lot of hardworking people who are struggling every day to make ends meet. There was one family that recently testified before Congress for the part of the Poor People's Campaign, where there's a woman who has 2 children, ages 9 and 16. One child is sleeping with a CPAP machine because she has sleep apnea. The home is a single-wide mobile home that's full of mold and mildew. There are so many holes in the homes that she has to use a trap to trap opossums to keep them from coming into the house. And I asked her, because she doesn't own a car, I said, what will happen if you're bitten by an opossum? That means she would have to be treated for rabies. And someone would have to get to her to take her to the hospital to be treated. And that is a very, very painful, I understand, experience to have to encounter. She got the mobile home in the late 1980s. The cost of it was about $127,000. She still owes $20,000 on it and is worth $2,000. That's an example of the type of structural poverty that exists. And recently I was talking to her and her sister about the wastewater situation, because when she flushes her toilet, the raw sewage is straight piped out onto the ground just outside the back of her mobile home. And we talked about it, and I found out that her sister had been arrested because she could not pay the fee to get garbage service, and they put them in jail. So they're criminalizing poverty as well, and the people that they're arresting cannot afford an extra bill, because we also have some of the highest power bills. This is a state that penalizes people for using solar power, and just increase the penalty for people to use the grid to use solar power. So that along with the raw sewage on the ground, which you saw, Ed also broke the story in September of last year, where we did a study with Baylor's National School of Tropical Medicine, and we found evidence of hookworm, which is a tropical parasite that's associated with poverty in Alabama. This is in plain sight, just outside of the state capitol, which memorializes just about every figure that was involved in the Confederacy that withdrew from the Union, protesting the end of slavery. So we are in Lowndes County every day, and I think throughout the Black Belt, and I think the problem with what we're seeing is that a lot of people that are making policy in Washington, it didn't just start with the Trump administration, but a lot of these people haven't been out of these ivory towers to actually go into these communities and see how people are living.
Well, can I pick you up on that, Catherine? You say it didn't start with the Trump administration, and a lot of what we just heard, obviously, was going back in time. This discussion today is human rights and poverty in the age of Trump. So picking up that second part, in the age of Trump, I'd be interested just between you to hear you talk to us about what precisely you fear the Trump administration could do to make a pretty bad situation, as we've heard, a lot worse. And Philip, kick us off. I mean, you mentioned the tax cuts, but in a way I'm more interested in the other warning that you give, which is that the social safety net, which is famously patchy in America already and has been for decades, could quickly become a lot worse. Talk to us about that fear of yours.
I neglected earlier to answer the second part of your question, which comes right back to this. The critics defending the administration have pointed out that the statistics that I used were from 2016, in other words, the Obama era. That's correct. Those are the latest available Census Bureau statistics. There are no more. There won't be until September of this year. So what I did was to say, look, there were 40 million people in poverty inherited from the Obama administration. What then is the Trump administration doing? And the answer is the massive tax cuts, which make the rich richer. But more importantly, it was announced even at the time that the tax cuts would be paid for in part by cuts in the welfare budget, which will certainly increase the number of people living in poverty. That's what they're moving ahead with now. The administration announced last week a grand plan, which observers don't think will get anywhere, to combine two government departments in a bid to make it much easier to push through the various reforms that they've been talking about. And the principal reform that we see across the board is this insistence that people who are currently getting benefits of one kind or another should have to demonstrate that they're out working, sometimes 20 or 30 hours a week. Now, and that applies to food stamps, it applies to Medicaid, it applies to housing subsidies and so on, across the board. And each time the administration has put forward one of these policies, they have predicted that it will get several million people off the relevant rolls. And so they themselves foresee that this will greatly reduce the number of people who are getting government benefits. That would be great if what they're promising happens. In other words, these people can go on to employment. They can't. First of all, the job market is really expanded to its fullest point. There's not a lot of space left. Secondly, more importantly, the great majority of these people, and studies show this, are not able to work. If you look at Medicaid statistics, you see that something like 50% are already working. Something like 43% of the rest are either doing full-time care work or else are students. And so it leaves 7% who could, in theory, be working. When they do get out into the job market, what they're going to find is what happened, what's documented as having happened last year, which is that wages actually dropped in the United States for 80% of those in the private sector doing non-managerial jobs. In other words, as Liz, I think, said, the quality of work is diminishing, wages are stagnating, and we're seeing ever more people who are working full-time but can't survive without food stamps, which is why food stamps go now to, I think it's 44 million people
So you take away the food stamps from those people, and what happens to them?
That's one of the ways in which poverty is simply going to be made worse. And the administration has this optimistic thing, no, they'll go out to work and they will replace the food stamps with income earned. But it doesn't happen that way.
Open it up.
I also wanted to respond and say that even with the jobs that are available, they don't pay a living wage. So that's a problem as well. And a lot of the people that I'm working with, sometimes I've been told that some people have to choose between purchasing medicine and eating. I mean, it shouldn't be that way, and that's a problem throughout the U.S. In addition to that, I'm connected to the military. I'm a veteran of the military myself, and I know people that are in the military that are collecting food stamps. If you go on most military bases in the United States, these same public welfare programs that they're talking about cutting are available to soldiers because that's what they qualify for. Because they are pretty much making the type of wages that would allow them to qualify and be able to get these programs. So clearly, and I don't know whether the numbers, when they calculate the people that are impoverished, they're looking at the people that are also on military bases that are actively serving in the military, and the families have to struggle and use these same types of programs to make ends meet.
Ken, the Trump threat?
Well, I mean, what Philip describes is this very deliberate two-step process. It's almost like a dance, Step one, cut taxes. Philip is highlighting appropriately, you cut taxes for the rich, but the point is really to cut revenue for the government, to starve the beast. Then step two is, oops, we don't have enough money for our social welfare programs. Oh, well, we better cut them. And so in a world where there are forces out there, whether it's globalization or robotization, or simply the long-standing attacks on trade unions in the United States, which has diminished workers' capacity to press for better wages, you have diminishing wages. You have jobs that are not capable of supporting a family. And many countries around the world are responding to that with ideas of having sort of a universal minimum wage, or simply raising the minimum wage of jobs. And the US is responding somewhat differently by cutting the bottom out of the social safety net. And so this is all quite deliberate. And if you look at it, it's because the poor in the United States don't vote Republican. And this administration has been very clever about targeting its policies to benefit what it sees as its base and not others. Now Philip appropriately points out that a lot of these cuts to the social welfare system are going to harm the working class whites that are seen as the Trump base. But just as this latest tax reform, very deliberately targeted big Democratic states, high tax states like New York or California. So they actually pay a disproportionate burden of supporting the federal government now after this reform. Similarly, these cuts in the social welfare network are seen as attacking people who don't vote Republican. And so there's not this sense of the need to look after the basic needs of all Americans, but rather dumping on those others, whether immigrants or the poor or what have you, at the expense of what Trump sees as his base.
Well, I was going to go on and ask the next question, so maybe and start with you, Liz. The Trump threat, to use very much shorthand, combined with the long-standing problem of poverty in this country, presents everyone working in this area with the question what to do about it, what effectively can be done. And you can ask that question for the general picture in America, which is, what can you do about the severe poverty that exists in this country? But you have an extra layer now. What can you do to resist the threats that may be coming and are coming from the Trump administration to make that problem very much worse, potentially very quickly? And you all come from different pieces of that same puzzle with very different approaches. And Liz, yours is decades old, but also one of the newest. It's kind of old and very new. It stresses moral revival, it's called, rather than human rights. It's obviously designed to generate a mobilization of people, but it's not political, it's not party political. So tell us about it. How does it work? What is the ambition? And how can it help this double problem of the endemic existing poverty plus the Trump threat?
So, I mean, I think where we have to kind of begin is the is the crisis that the United States is in right now. And actually, the figures that we use in the Poor People's Campaign isn't just that there's 40 million poor people, isn't just that there's 18 million extremely poor people, but that if you use the supplemental poverty measure, there's 140 million poor people, poor and low-income people in the United States. And that's not a made-up figure. That's 43.5% of the population. There's other studies that have come out basically very recently saying that close to half of the US population can't really make ends meet. The stats around the federal poverty, the minimum wage, is that there is not a city, there is not a county in all of the United States where if you're working one full-time job making the federal minimum wage, can you afford a 2-bedroom apartment? There isn't a city, a town, a county in the entire country where if you're working full-time, you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment. So the breadth and depth of poverty is at crisis proportions. 80% of people in the United States at some point in our lives will not be able to make ends meet. So that's economically insane. That's, constitutionally against what we were founded on. It's also immoral and unjust. It's also just wrong. How is it that we throw away more food than it takes to feed everybody, but there are kids starving in the United States? Like, how is it that there's more luxury housing units in the United States than there are homeless people, but there are people dying on the streets, right? And so it's not an either human rights or kind of moral revival. It's how is a moral revival about bringing the values of human rights into the public sphere? How is it that we tap into the fact that the real moral issues of our day are, do you have health care? Do you have living wages? Can you make ends meet? And not a very small number of issues that a kind of group of religious nationalists, Christian nationalists focus on.
And how does it help? What's the end game? I mean, you get arrested on the steps of the Supreme Court. What does that then do?
Right. Well, I mean, so I think there's a lot of questions there. I mean, so we've been a part of a massive nonviolent civil disobedience movement. And that is because in other moments in history, both in the United States and other places around the world, there comes a time when people have to put themselves out there and have to kind of show the unjustness of the policies and laws that exist. I mean, right now, as Catherine was saying, it's perfectly legal to be poor. What's illegal is to kind of challenge that system. In the United States right now, there are 64 million people working jobs that pay less than a living wage. There are 400 people making $197,000 an hour. But we lock up people who are fighting to get 15 in a union. And we let the folks that are making $197 an hour be able to, have 10 houses and 4 boats and have that, and have their taxes relieved and have, so I think how we come from it is that you change things by building a movement. You change things by building up the power of people. And that who are the most impacted, the most affected by poverty? Poor people, folks that have their votes being suppressed, folks that are living with poisoned water, that folks have very little or even nothing to lose. And if they, in the words of Dr. King, can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life. And so basing on history and also on the power of people today, we're organizing. We're in a major organizing drive of what does it look like to change politics in the United States by building the power of people from below.
Now, Liz, you spoke powerfully about inequality, which is the other flip side of the same coin here. And of course, America suffers terribly from that as well. It's the most unequal in terms of income distribution of any rich nation. And with the 1.5 trillion tax cuts, it's headed to get incredibly much worse. So, but Philip, an interesting point there in terms of your world of international law and human rights. How can international human rights accommodate the concept of inequality? I mean, how can you almost legislate for a standard on inequality which could then, governments could be held against? Is that possible?
It would be nice, Ed, but I think it's not the way to look at it. I think the big challenge which you're describing is that those of us who have worked in the human rights field for a long time, I mean, you can almost picture this in a way. It's obviously a great overstatement, but in a sense, the human rights community for many years has been saying, look, torture, killings, arbitrary detention, look over there. And meanwhile, in all of the rest of the room, the entire economic system has been changing. The spread of neoliberal economic ideology, which is now dominant everywhere, the use of tax systems. So the US big tax cuts transform the overall stage, they transform a whole range of policy issues, but the human rights community very often has continued to look over there and to do great work over there. And so as a group, I think we need to ask ourselves then, what can we do about it? Which comes to your question. Inequality is a very difficult issue to get a grasp of. Inequality itself is something that we accept in our economic systems. We assume that it's necessary for competition. It's not per se a bad thing. So what we're talking about is extreme inequality, and the question is how to get at that. I'm afraid my solution is to go back to basics. In other words, if you don't really recognize and incorporate into your framework essential economic and social rights, then you're never going to be making a strike against inequality. So even The Economist had a cover story a few weeks ago about how important universal health coverage is for every country, that it's a good investment, that if you don't have it, you're losing a fortune in terms of lower quality workers, less healthy workers. It's good for the economy. But it's also, of course, moral. And I think if we're serious about inequality, we need to get back and establish those ground rules that every society must be prepared to pay for essential forms of social protection for all its people. That's the best way to struggle against inequality, because you're at least raising the base. And it also means that those who are at the top are going to be subject to increased demands in terms of taxation and redistribution.
Again, pick up on that. I mean, the shaming model, to use a shorthand, for the work that you do, what can your shaming model do to help? Because we're talking in this bit about tactics, strategy, and solutions. What can the shaming model bring to bear in this area of poverty and inequality?
Right. Well, let me, if I could, respond to both Liz's and Philip's recent comments. With respect to establishing that something is wrong, we discussed already how in the United States, because it hasn't ratified the relevant treaty, because the relevant laws are not there, this is not an issue you can go to court on. You can't, for the most part, say there are too many poor people, we're going to sue. So you have to use shaming strategies. And there are different ways to shame. There's what Liz is doing, which is putting a bunch of people in the street and just demonstrating through their presence that this is outrageous. There is, using social media and letting people, without necessarily getting in the streets, but just, talking about that among their friends and their colleagues to demonstrate that this is wrong. And then there's using traditional media, getting The Guardian to write about this. These are all ways of highlighting the individual stories of poverty, trying to develop moral outrage, because there actually isn't really a difference between human rights and moral shaming in this realm, because there isn't a law you can look to. All you really have is to develop the sense of moral right and wrong, and get more and more people to recognize that this is wrong. So at a certain point, you force government to change. So I think in terms of strategy, we're all largely on the same page. I wanted to address the inequality point, and I pose this as a genuine question, because this is something that Human Rights Watch itself is grappling with right now. Philip just now in his comments kind of started with inequality, but then came back to extreme poverty. And that's in many ways the easy answer, because I think we all would agree that the least you can do to address inequality is to address extreme poverty. And that means, bringing people up to a certain basic level. And if the funds are not there because of the starve the beast strategy of the Trumps of the world, then you've got to raise taxes in order to make that possible. And obviously you start with a progressive system of taxation, going at the people who can most afford to pay more taxes, the rich. So that's the least that we can mean. But that kind of definition of inequality isn't really describing anything from a fight against extreme poverty. And so I think the real question is, from a human rights perspective, do we object to inequality in and of itself, even if we can imagine a world where we've dealt with extreme poverty? And that's a tough question. And there are arguments you can make. You can say that inequality warps the democratic system because rich people have more of a say. But there are also other ways of dealing with that. You can limit campaign contributions. You can fight felony disenfranchisement. You can fight this voter suppression efforts. There are ways of trying to make democracy more democratic, more responsive to people's actual needs without necessarily going after inequality per se. The most developed theory of modern times on inequality was done by John Rawls. And his theory is, he has something called the difference principle, which basically says you cannot justify any inequality except insofar as it's necessary to benefit the worst off person. So it's actually a very radical proposition, that if you cannot show an improvement of the most impoverished, you can't tolerate inequality. Now that, would be it's a complete contradiction of the sort of, laissez-faire, trickle-down theory that informs the US government's policies today. But it's also, it would really reshape the modern economy and probably shrink the modern economy substantially. That probably is more than you can get most people to buy onto. But, is there a human rights argument against inequality beyond what we all agree on, which is you have to take steps to fight extreme poverty? And we're grappling with that. And I whether through the web or here, I would welcome ideas on how we might proceed on that.
I want to get to a couple of areas of sort of actual stuff that's in the report before we open up to questions. And starting with, back to our friend Nikki Haley, one of her riposts to you, I think it came in the official response to your report, Philip, was that leave poverty alone in the United States, that's a domestic political issue. We will deal with it politically through our elected representatives, which kind of neatly raises the issue of American democracy and the fact that it's pretty much under attack itself at the moment. One thinks of the 6 million people who have no vote because they've been disenfranchised because of their felony records. One thinks of the uniquely low turnout rate in major elections. And one thinks of the voter suppression techniques that are going on across many states in America as we speak. So if Nikki Haley's answer is, leave it to us, politics will do it through our elected representatives, and at the same time those elections are being distorted, it seems on one level quite consciously, in order to suppress particularly the turnout of minorities and African Americans. You have to kind of wonder whether that argument goes full circle. Catherine, Alabama, for instance, just since the Selby decision of the Supreme Court, which gutted a large part of the Voting Rights Act 5 years ago, I think almost to the week, since then there's been 7 major attempts to tamper with voting rights in the states, in that state, in a way that would, were it allowed to continue, suppress the turnout of particularly African Americans, Alabamans. Talk to us about what it's like on the ground for you.
Well, in Alabama, people are required to have voter ID, and a lot of when they passed the law to require them to have a government identification in order to vote, they simultaneously closed a lot of the driver's license locations that were in those areas that were heavily populated by African Americans. So as a result, that meant that in areas that were especially rural in the Black Belt, they had to travel a long distance in order to get access to voter identification in order to vote. Along with that, there's been a large effort in Alabama. So many people are incarcerated that they take away their voting rights. And as a result, if they're convicted of a felony, they can't vote or they have to apply to get their voting rights back. And that process can take 2 or 3 years if they get it back at all. So there have been numerous attempts to prevent people from voting in terms of redistricting. People have been packed into districts so that there would be 2 or 3 maybe black seats, or in the case of the U.S. Congress, there's 1 black seat that Congresswoman Terry Sewell represents that district, because most of the black people have been packed into this 1 district where, and then there are certain districts that have been guaranteed to be Republican because they drew the lines so they can just be one way instead of giving people the option to choose. So there's been just a lot of attempts to stop people from actually going to the polls and voting, and I think that we have to push back and find ways in which to make the process more fair. And if you look at the last election results, we just had a primary, and in that primary, you can see some of the results in terms of who voted. There were some candidates on one side where they had more votes that were cast on the GOP side for the gubernatorial candidates than probably all the people that voted Democratic statewide. So clearly there's a lot of work to be done to make sure that it's fair and balanced.
And Liz, you talked about mobilizing people. Presumably part of that is an electoral strategy to get people to the polls, whichever way they vote, just get them to vote. And yet, as we know, it's often poor people who vote in fewer numbers. The turnout is particularly poor for poor people.
Yeah, I mean, so I think talking about voting rights and our impoverished democracy is actually a real starting point when we're going to take on the question of poverty. You know, in the 2016 presidential election, there were 26 debates. In those 26 debates, in the primary and in the general election, there wasn't an hour spent on the fact that we had fewer voting rights in that election than we had 50 years ago. There wasn't an hour spent on the issue of poverty, or a half hour. I'd take 20 minutes. There wasn't an hour spent on the kind of chaos of climate change and ecological devastation, or on living wages, or on issues like healthcare and single-payer healthcare, right? So somehow we got through that crazy campaign with 26 debates without talking about the issues that affect the majority of people, especially poor people, right? And then we had 23 states that have enacted voter suppression laws since 2010. 23 states, all of the southern states. We mapped those states out when we were thinking about this Poor People's Campaign. And we said, what are the states that have enacted voter suppression laws? And then also, what are the states that have engaged in voter suppression? They didn't even need laws. Like the emergency manager system of Michigan, or even in New York. I mean, you don't need voter suppression because you already only have 1 day of voting. You already you can't vote in the primaries unless you're, in a particular political party. All of these things. So you don't need voter suppression laws. You already have voter suppression worked into that system. So we mapped out the states that have voter suppression laws and other, forms, and then we did a map. What are the states with the highest poverty? Same states. What are the states with the highest child poverty? Same states. What are the states that have the least health care, the lowest wages, the least protections of LGBTQ communities, the least protections of immigrants, the least environmental protections? It's all the same states. And so if you use this point of voter suppression, of impoverishing our democracy, of denying people their right to vote, suppressing people's votes, you elect candidates who then pass policies that impact people on the bottom across the board and make life worse for everybody. And so a huge part of this next phase of the Poor People's Campaign is a voter registration, a voter mobilization campaign targeting poor communities, because Also, I don't know if people know, but we had close to 900 fewer polling places in the 2016 elections. 900 fewer places for poor people and for people of color to vote. In Wisconsin, the state that I grew up in, there were 250,000 votes that were suppressed. Trump supposedly only won by 30,000. There were 250,000 votes, right? And like was being said before, who voted for Trump were not poor people. Maybe a third of the people that were voting for Trump make less than the median income in this country. 2/3 make more. And so this notion that poor white people, that working class white people brought him into power, no, it's just not true. There's no statistics and facts that say, sure, there are some poor white people, sure, there were some poor black people, sure, there were some, but I think this question of voter suppression and the fact that nobody, Democrats and Republicans, are not talking in the way that we should be. I mean, how is it that people fought and died for voting rights 50 years ago, 55 years ago, and we have fewer voting protections? And how is it that Strom Thurmond, filibustered the Voting Rights Act for one day, and we all remember that, but that the people in power now, Ryan and McConnell, these folks, have filibustered it for 5 years now.
I wonder, in the second area that's in your report, Philip, I wondered whether children offer a clue in terms of what can be done to move forward. 13 million children in the United States living in poverty. A third of those living in poverty are children. I wonder whether it's a clue because what we've seen down at the border in the last few weeks, one of the few examples where it looks like, although we're not quite sure because it's very difficult to tell, whether the administration is pushing backwards now and is pulling away from what it's been doing in terms of family separation, but it does look as though it has been forced to restrain itself. And you can't say that about many things since President Trump came into the White House. So does children offer us a clue?
I would love to think so. I think what you've got here, of course, is the difference between, to bring it back to Europe, the dead refugee child washing up on the shores of the Mediterranean, which pulls at everyone's heartstrings and generates demands for change, and the fact that thousands and thousands of children are out there looking for a home and no one's focused on it. I think the United States is probably closer to that, to a comparable scenario. It's not a coincidence that the United States is the only country in the world that has not ratified the Convention on the Rights of the Child. It makes a difference. Every other country has changed over the last 30 or 40 years and come to accept that children have rights in their own right. No matter how old they are, as they grow older, they get more rights and so on. In the United States, you still have much more this paternalistic notion that they belong to their parents. And so if they belong to their parents, well, why not punish the children in order to punish the parents who are trying to cross the border? You don't see children as separate and deserving. And the bizarre thing about it, of course, is that if the administration were simply economically rational, heartless, but economically rational, they would be looking at it and saying, actually, having so many children living in poverty is lowering our educational levels, lowering our health levels, and is actually going to be very costly in the future. And we should adopt more humane policies purely for economic reasons, but that's not happening either.
Let me, if I could, respond to two of these last points. First, on voter suppression. I completely agree with what Liz says. I would actually start earlier. Because if you look at, for example, the drug war. Now, you may say, what does the drug war have to do with voter suppression? Well, people of color and whites in the United States use drugs at basically the same rate. All the studies show that. People of color are prosecuted for nonviolent drug offenses at, depending on the state, 5 times as often to sometimes 45 times as often. Then you add on that bail is applied without regard to the people's ability to pay it. It means that you have a large number of people of color who are imprisoned selectively because of their drug use, basically coerced into pleading guilty. And then when you're in a state that has so-called felony disenfranchisement, deprived of the vote for the rest of their lives, usually unless they go through some difficult procedure that no one ever does. So, you have to look more broadly at why there is such a diminished ability to vote by many minority communities in the United States. Now, with respect to children, it looks for the moment like Trump is pulling back on the idea of separating immigrant children from their parents. What people are not focusing on is that Trump is increasing the separation of US citizen children from their immigrant parents. And by that I mean, Trump is not doing simply what Obama already was doing, which is trying to reinforce border controls with respect to new arrivals. Trump is very deliberately going after the long-term immigrant. And of the 11 million undocumented immigrants in the United States today, roughly 60% of them, 60, has been in the United States a decade or more. What that tends to mean is that they have US citizen children. And so when Trump increases deportations from the interior of the country by 43%, as the latest statistics suggest he is doing, he is separating the non-US citizen parents from the US citizen kids. You can imagine what that does to poverty, let alone how that tears families apart. I mean, imagine you're a mom or dad, and you have to choose, are you going to live separately from your kids? How are your kids going to fend for themselves back in the United States? Or do you bring them to Honduras where the gangs are going to prey on them? I mean, there are these awful situations, but these US citizen kids who are of the wrong ethnicity, the wrong parentage, just don't count in the Trump calculus.
I want to ask one final question from me and then open up. So if the mics could get ready for questions from people in the room. Final question is, the person who's not on stage with us is the member of the Trump administration. Perhaps we should have had an empty chair like the Human Rights Council. But it does raise the issue of partisanship. Philip's report had an incredible response from Bernie Sanders and 20 very senior Democrats, several of whom are expected to run in the next presidential election, picking up on the points that you made and asking the administration to do work in this area to improve the situation. But there was no signatory from any Republican member of Congress, and nor was any other similar Republican letter. We heard from Liz before we came out today that you had a similar thing. You went to have a congressional meeting in Congress, no Republicans turned up. Now, surely this is a major problem for you because, without a dialogue, without a positive response from the Republican Party, how can you possibly move forward? Talk to us about partisanship and how you're going to overcome it, whoever wants to.
Well, I'll start only because I'm in a state that's a red state, meaning that it's mostly Republican. What I try to do in terms of the work that I'm doing in Alabama is raising the issue where people can't ignore it and call it fake news. So people don't want to believe that there are cesspools in Alabama, that there's raw sewage on the ground. There's even a concerted effort to discount the study and say that we didn't find hookworm. But you cannot deny that there is, in fact, raw sewage on the ground, and that there is an unequal way in which the government distributes the funds to bring sewage treatment to people in the state. For an example, in Lowndes County, people that were the business owners, right after the study was published and announced in The Guardian, the next month, money was awarded to a town to expand water and sewer for the wealthy. However, those people that were poor still have raw sewage on the ground. So the way and what they've tried to do is suppress us from telling this story. They've even started to try to intimidate some of the families who allowed the media to come. So now other families are coming forward and they're telling their stories too. So I think it goes back to what Ken said about shaming the government. So I think that we have to show that in these districts throughout the United States, we actually have to give face to poverty. I think when people hear figures, it's abstract. But if you actually can put a face on it, and people can see families that are actually living in these conditions, it forces them to have to respond to it. And I think that that's how we can hopefully eventually have either some dialogue or some change.
So while we did this Capitol Hill hearing and some of the Democratic elected officials came, who's been participating in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has been Republicans and Democrats and independents all together. You know, we've featured, we've been doing a lot of organizing, you know, really strongly in McConnell country, right, in Kentucky. Some of the strongest work of the campaign has been there. Folks that actually elected him into office, who now see that their health care is being cut, their taxes are, you know, the earned income tax credit isn't coming their way. The employment numbers and wages are low. This was true in North Carolina, this was true in South Carolina, a bunch of states where we actually have folks, you know, being arrested in nonviolent civil disobedience, doing organizing, who are crossing party lines. And so when we say that our movement isn't left or right, Democrat or Republican, it's about right or wrong, like, we actually mean that, right? And it's going to take the power of people coming together to be able to win policy changes. You know, all of these problems existed before the Trump administration. You know, now every week there's something else that's very scary, and it's about, you know, people's lives really being, you know, on the edge. And so it's not to belittle the fear that's in so many of our members, you know, bodies and souls and minds, because, I mean, how do you just justify cutting 7 million kids off a chip? How do you just justify raising rents of HUD houses, which will mean 20% more people become homeless? How do you just, I mean, and just like, and go down the line. I mean, literally so again, we are in an era of Trump. And what we have found is that the way to accomplish anything is by building coalition between anybody who is being impacted, and not waiting for politicians to save us, but having people build the power to be able to save ourselves. Make it impossible that we could go through another election and not talk about the issues. Make it impossible to not have candidates that are actually for universal single-payer health care. Make it impossible to make an isolated, you know, event around family separation become, you know, the target of so much kind of venomous, you know, attack. But instead, for people to say, look at this, like, we're, you know, places that people are being separated from healthcare here, and separated from good wages here, and separated from their votes here, and we're going to all band together because anyone that's being hurt is any one of us. And so, I mean, I'm seeing something very hopeful amongst, you know, some of the places that are the poorest in the United States, but where Republicans and Democrats and others are coming together to say we can build the people's movement.
Ken, did you want to say?
I just want to caution against having too much faith that this is just a Democratic solution rather than Republican, because obviously Trump has been awful in all the things we're discussing here. But, you know, what Philip was describing, the linkage of social welfare to actually having a job, you know, that began in the modern era with Bill Clinton, with his so-called welfare reform. So, you know, I think the answer, you know, as Liz, you're suggesting, is to you've got to really focus on the actual policies. It's not enough to just be partisan here. Now, we have to, I think, very deliberately take on some of the ideology. For example, Trump talks about deregulation as if it's, you know, lifting these chains and burdens off the backs of, you know, entrepreneurs who will just make us all richer. And when you know, bring that down to reality, deregulation means suddenly, you know, reversing some of these Obama-era efforts to ensure healthcare for everybody, or to ensure that environmental devastation doesn't impede people's health, or, you know, a number of steps that, you know, are having dramatic effect on people's ability to have clean water, to have access to sanitation, and things of that sort. So the key to that, I mean, as Catherine, you're saying, is to focus on the stories, to focus on the individuals, and to show how people with whom others can identify are affected by these policy changes. Now, I want to end with a sliver of optimism here, which is that the United States is a very deeply divided country, as is much of Europe. And Trump won this election. He obviously didn't even win the popular vote. He won the Electoral College by a very narrow margin. And if you just took a few 100,000 votes that would have gone differently, it would be a different president. What that suggests is that you don't have to convert the far-right ideologues. It's enough to focus on the movable middle, the people who are independents, who are not ideologically committed one way or another. They voted this way because they didn't like Hillary, or because they felt they were unhappy with the system and they were voting against the system. There are lots of reasons why people voted the way they did. But if you can persuade 5% of the people, probably less than that, that this utter neglect of the poor is not only devastating for them, but horrible for the United States as a nation, you can change this. And so that's really, I think, where we've got to direct our energies.
And Philip, to have the response to your report from the administration, pretty much a blanket denial rather than an engagement with you, that's a problem, right? I mean, what can you in your situation do about that?
I think that's what the international human rights system is all about. It's premised on the assumption that most governments are blind to their own shortcomings. And that very few of them are suddenly going to say, oh yeah, we weren't aware of that, we better change our policies. If you point out to the Australian government that its policies on asylum seekers are a complete violation of international law, immoral, outrageous, etc., they're going to say exactly what the Trump administration said to me, which is, we make our own policies, we're doing the best for the people we care about. But that's not the focus. It's not a question of suddenly getting Nikki Haley or one of Trump's cabinet secretaries to say, oh my God, I didn't realize things were so grim. It's the role of the international community to help to shed, to shine a spotlight on what the issues are, to give at least some encouragement to people within the country that the efforts that you're making to try to bring about a new world, a different society, and Liz and the Reverend Barbara are doing absolutely brilliant work. That's where the international community can play a role. So I'm not sitting at home waiting for a call from the administration. I'm trying to encourage the vast range of people who have written to me, groups that have taken it up, the ACLU that sent it to Governor Brown in California saying, what are you doing about this report? That's where the action is.
Someone right at the back.
Hi, thank you for a very enlightening discussion. My name is Francisco Rivera. I run the Human Rights Clinic in Santa Clara Law in California, but I'm from Puerto Rico. And Professor Alston, in your research, you went to Puerto Rico and you addressed the poverty and inequality of the 4 million US citizens that live there. I was wondering if you could explain to this audience and those at home, because not many people know about the situation in Puerto Rico, about the issue of poverty and inequality in Puerto Rico. Thank you.
You can always pick someone from Puerto Rico because they have this distinctive characteristic of perfect English combined with pronouncing Puerto Rico in perfect Spanish. As I said in my report, it's the poorest non-state in the Union. It has no vote in Congress. It currently has an oversight board imposed on it which has virtually full powers to do whatever it wants to do and is pursuing a very strong anti-social protection set of policies. So the situation in Puerto Rico is grim. And in the tax reform bill that handed money to all the elites around the country, Puerto Rico was one of the few obvious additional losers. I think it comes back to the old story of democracy that if you don't have a vote, your voice is not going to be listened to, and that's certainly what we see with Puerto Rico in the current situation in the United States.
No, you.
Thank you for Faster, Juncker.
Thank you for that enlightening discussion. My name is David, and I'm a graduate student in London. I was wondering what you think about, this doesn't really come up in your discussion, but the presence of so many guns in the States, and if that colors at all the path forward for dealing with these issues in terms of avoiding anything that, you know, causes a lot of noise and damage but doesn't actually change things once the dust clears.
Let's take one more and we'll do it together. You two to your left? Did you want to say something? Oh, no. Okay. Further, a little bit further back, Junka. Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Zafar Shahid. I had a question regarding social movement. It's too often regarded that the United States is full of right-wing religious people, and they're the ones that are behind a broader political right-wing movement. I think, for what I hear from you, is that it's a much more complex situation. It would be nice to hear what you have to say about religion and social justice. Thank you.
Okay, guns and religion and social justice. Who goes? Well, Liz, do the religion piece.
Right. You know, just thousands of years
Should be
of...
posted and get Liz to do guns.
I
You
could
can
do
to do
guns.
religion.
Exactly. Right, so I, as you probably can tell, am a pastor. I'm a biblical scholar, and I'm motivated to do the work both out of personal experience of poverty, but then also out of my religious convictions. And this Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, has actually been led by kind of two major strands of the population in the U.S. Poor folks who have nothing to lose, but, you know, their chains, I could tell, you know, and actually a lot of clergy and moral leaders who, I don't identify myself as the religious left. I don't actually think kind of that right-left dichotomy helps. I don't think you should call people that you think are wrong right. And I don't think that actually what's in the Bible at the core and heart of it is really up for debate. Like when Jesus comes into Nazareth and announces that he's on a mission to this world, he says, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me. He has anointed me to bring good news, evangelion, like the word for evangelical. I don't think it's possible to be an evangelical without doing justice. And I don't think that's because I have particular political beliefs. It's because I've studied the Bible. I've studied the Bible amongst social movements. I've studied the Bible amongst religious scholars. And there's no place when the word good news or evangelical is in that Bible that isn't connected to doing righteousness and doing justice. There are more than 2,000 passages in the Bible that are about uplifting the poor. There's very few passages on the things that people think are the moral issues of our day. Jesus was not a card-carrying member of the NRA. He just wasn't. Like, there isn't any place...
Is that the gun bit?
You know, there isn't any place like where, you know, where that comes out. I mean, what he did was he traveled around the land setting up free healthcare clinics, not charging lepers co-pays, right? I mean, like, it's just like, and this is just what's there. And I think it's actually not an accident then that there is always a battle of theology in social movements. Like, so if folks know anything about the abolitionist movement in the United States, slaveholders created a Bible that did not include the Exodus. It did not include the prophets. It did not include that passage from Jesus I just referred to. And they quoted Paul in terms of just slaves obey your masters and this, but the abolitionists, like someone like Harriet Tubman, was known in her day as Harriet Moses Tubman, right? And people understood what she was doing was, with that Underground Railroad, was freeing people from slavery. And William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass and all the abolitionists engaged in studying Deuteronomy and Leviticus. And so I think that there's not an accident that there's a battle of theology, I think, when it comes to justice and injustice. But what's at the heart of these faith traditions, and I, I'm Christian and I am a New Testament scholar, so I just did a lot of Jesus for y'all. But, when I hang out with my Muslim brothers and sisters and hang out with my Jewish brothers and sisters, we just had this beautiful Shabbat service right before the Poor People's Campaign rally, and it's the same. Like, what people are saying, what's at the heart of our teachings is, care for the immigrant, uplifting everybody, making society be organized around the needs of everyone. And so a huge part of this moral revival is actually trying to bring people back both to constitutional values. So I was really surprised when the official statement from the mission, starts with property rights. Like, how do you not in the United States start with the Declaration of Independence? Like, how do you not start with, pursuit of happiness and, these, that's what what the U.S. was founded on, not property rights like that. And if you're going to say that it's property rights, you're already skewing history. You have a political position that So.
Anyone want to take on guns?
Right. What is the relationship between guns and poverty? I will take a stab at this. And let me suggest two connections. I think everybody's aware of the Second Amendment in the United States. Most people don't know what it says. It actually doesn't say, you have a right to have a gun. It talks about the rights of states to have well-ordered militia. And basically, it's a way of having the states be a defense against a tyrannical federal government. It took an extreme Supreme Court to interpret that provision to say that every individual has a right to have his or her own gun. That could change at some point, once the costs are seen. And I think one angle is that states also under human rights law, even under the human rights law that the US recognizes, have a duty to provide physical security. And the gun epidemic in the United States, thanks to the National Rifle Association, has been a security disaster. If you look at just murder rates in the United States compared to any other Western country, they're astronomical because of the gun epidemic. And so this idea that, I need a gun to protect me from you is ridiculous. I'm much more likely to be killed because of the epidemic of guns than I am to secure myself. And the people who are most likely to face violence are the poor. And so that's, one very obvious connection. The other that I would stress is that guns are one of these classic social movement diversions against discussing everything we've been talking about today. And I could substitute, abortion, I could substitute, immigration, racism in various forms, but, the Trumps of the world have been brilliant at using these sort of social issues to prevent us from talking about poverty and about the policies that further poverty. And so I just see guns as one of these classic things. You get people riled up, they're going to take away my gun. I'm going to vote for the person who lets me keep my gun. And even though those policies are probably making me much worse off economically, I'm going to keep my gun. And, it doesn't take many people thinking that way, and sadly many do, to skew the political environment in the direction that we have today.
Yes, the woman in the dots. Yes. That's you, yes. Yes.
I just wanted to direct this to Philip. Mandatory voting, which Australia does, would seem to offer a solution to one of the problems all the problems you've described. I don't know whether this is actually possible or whether it's not even worth talking about because it could never happen in the US, but what do you feel about that?
Can we take one more as well? Yes, the woman in front. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to say two things that I feel like we're getting around to them, but we haven't really addressed them. And this is that the Republicans mainly, but also the Democrats, have prevailed on two discourses. One is that if you're poor, it's your fault. So it's a part of the demonization of the poor, but it blocks action. It profound levels, individual and social action, I think. And the other is that government is bad, and government is not responsible for dealing with all the issues that we're talking about. And I don't see, and these, of course, both completely fly in the face of any sort of human rights regime, which is built on the equal dignity and value of every individual and the responsibility of government. But the human rights world, of which I've been a part for 30 years, has been abysmal, I think, at counteracting these two things, and especially in the area of economic and social and cultural rights. So I wondered if the panel could respond to that.
So, Philip, give us a short answer on compulsory voting, and then move on to the other one, and then we'll throw the second question open.
On compulsory voting, I mean, a lot of Americans would respond to say, we want freedom, and freedom includes not having to vote if we don't want to. But what I've suggested in my report is that surely it's an obligation of government, any government, which considers itself democratic, to do everything it can to maximize the turnout. And if you have 64% of people registered, and many lower than that actually voting, government should be asking themselves, what can we do to change this? Because it ain't a democracy by the time you get a very small number of people making the decisions. As for the second comment, you are spot on. Those are exactly the two areas where I think we have all failed. The stigmatization is constant. The emphasis on employment, which is repeated in Australia now in exactly the same terms as in the United States, is designed to stigmatize. You know why these people are on welfare? You know why they're on benefits? Because they're lazy bastards who won't get off their asses and work. And that's the sort of rallying cry. It's not saying, a lot of them, you know, have disabilities. A lot of them have psychosocial problems. A lot of them are caring full-time for relatives whom the state will not help in any way at all. A lot of them are traumatized. A lot of them have got very bad education, shocking health because there's no health care. Those are the people that the government needs to assist to become more productive. But instead it's the stigmatization discourse that is absolutely dominant. And then the other report that I presented to the Council is on the International Monetary Fund and social protection, and which seems extremely boring, but it's absolutely crucial in the way that you describe. It's all about the IMF needing to acknowledge that governments, even going through austerity, what they call fiscal consolidation, have to maintain space for social protection and thus a minimal role for a decent government. But all of the direction of international economic policy is going in the other direction. Government is bad. The best government is small and invisible. Let's privatize all the rest. And privatized industries, privatized actors will never be human rights actors.
And Catherine, on that point about stigmatization, which Philip raised so strongly, it's also in your report, I think, that the stigma is often that the poor are black or African American, whereas the reality is the majority of poor are white, and yet the stigma of the poor person is a caricature of African Americans. Do you feel that in Alabama?
Not just in Alabama, but throughout the United States, and I even think that the response to Philip's report, when there were African nations that were mentioned, I think that was intentional because they tend to
just to say, they said, why hadn't he studied Burundi and the Democratic Republic of Congo?
Yes,
the two African countries are the only countries they referenced.
Yes, and I believe that basically what has happened in the United States, we have not dealt with racism. And as a result, a lot of the structures that are in place reinforces even poverty. And because I think what they're trying to present is to say that, you know, these structures won't impact you. They're just impacting African Americans, and it leaves people in a position where they feel like it's not going to have any kind of, they're not going to see it in their own communities. But along with the New Poor People's Campaign, I had the opportunity to go through Appalachia, and I saw in West Virginia the same thing I saw in Alabama. I've seen in other parts of the country, even we went to Standing Rock and places like that, people are struggling throughout the United States, and I think the structure needs to change. When we talk about poverty, there are structures in place that impact everyone, and we have to look at policies, and how do we change those policies so that everyone can benefit and have access to human rights.
Perhaps the final two questions to take together. A woman here in the green, and then a man at the back with his hand up. Yes, yeah. With your glasses on, yeah, yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, thank you all for talking. I was born and raised in the States. I'm from Tennessee, actually, so a lot of this very much resonates with what I've seen. But I've lived in Switzerland now for 2 years, and I'm also a citizen of Switzerland. And the two big differences I see in the political system and the Swiss system is that, one, we vote almost every 4 months on referendums that are brought up by anybody from the canton or at the federal level. Like any citizen, if you get something like 50 or 100,000 signatures, that gets voted on in your whole canton. I've never heard of that in the US, and we sign petitions all the time. But it just really sounds like in the States, we really don't have a lot of political power at all, and it took me to move here to realize that. The other question I wanted to ask is, I mean, I feel like everyone feels like they're on the same page of this two-party system doesn't work. So what does it take for that to change? Because what happens is the government doesn't worry about trying to figure out how to get more people to vote, because what they need is to make sure they get enough votes from the people that are voting. So why get more people and add more variables? They want less people to vote to make sure that they can control those people. So how do we get rid of a two-party system in the US?
Yeah, thanks very much. My name is Milun Kothari. I'm a human rights scholar activist. There's this global pastime now of criticizing everything that Donald Trump does, which is probably correct. But the point I want to make is that it's not only his administration. I think there's a long legacy of the history of the United States, from the genocide of the Native Americans to slavery to, the breaking down of the New Deal. And the question I wanted to ask Reverend Theoharis and Catherine is, was it really that different under the Obama administration? I mean, we speak about the healthcare system, but what about everything else? And I also wanted to ask Ken Roth, what about the responsibility of the US human rights community in this? I mean, your own organization has historically been very much focused on civil and political rights, and it's great to hear that you're doing ESC rights now. But why come to it so late when there's such a long-standing history? And finally, I think that if you could also address this issue of the limitations of the shaming model. I mean, now even in the human rights world, we're moving towards this universal periodic review. It's more constructive, and the realization of economic, social, cultural rights, I think, and I think Philip would agree, are, if you're more constructive, if you offer alternatives, you don't only just shame, it's much more positive that way. So I'm just wondering about these two things. Thanks.
So there's a lot of different things between the two questions. So why don't we do this as a sort of final comment from each of you, and pick out whatever you like, and also make a last word if you want to. So Catherine, start with you. We'll come back this way.
Well, I agree that the problems that we're addressing didn't start with the Trump administration. That's why I said earlier that this is structural poverty. This was not, this is something that has existed since the beginning of America. And I think the way in which we can deal with finding solutions is engaging people more on the local level, local government, and just local communities, getting them involved. One of the things that we've been doing with the organization that I've been working with is partnering with universities to help them give voice to people in the community, to help people in the community develop policies and then take them to the politicians, and hopefully they will enact them. And I think it will also, because we talk about voting, and I think we should vote, but I think we also should be involved in terms of developing policies that work, because there have been Democrats, and there was one example that was given a few minutes ago with Bill Clinton and his administration. There have been Democrats that have pushed policies that have reinforced poverty, and we have to call them out, whether they're Democrats or Republicans, and we also have to work to make those changes. And I'm glad too that we're starting to look at human rights issues in the United States, because often we look everywhere else and we never look at what's happening. We're the first to criticize everybody else, and we never look at what's happening within our country. And that's one of the things I appreciate about Philip coming to Alabama and going to other parts of the United States and shining the light on these kinds of issues.
Ken?
All right. Well, let me just give a bit of context to the question here. There is a distinct ideology here in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council down the road that you shouldn't shame. You should work cooperatively with governments. And the main proponents of this view are China, Russia, Venezuela, Cuba, Egypt, the usual suspects. Now, it sounds great. China even had a whole resolution called the win-win formula. We're going to cooperate. Now, it's great if you have a well-intentioned government that just doesn't really know the ins and outs on how to improve rights. And you can say, look, this is how they did it over there, why don't you do it? And they'll say, oh, great idea, we'll do that tomorrow, Now, needless to say, most governments are not like that. And what we've been describing here today, it's not like Trump doesn't know how to fight poverty, it's that he doesn't care. He sees his constituents as the unimpoverished. He sees the impoverished as the others, and he's going to leave them there. So in a situation like that, to go in and say, let's cooperate, here's a good model on how we fight poverty, is going to get you absolutely no place. And the only way to move an administration like that is through pressure. And the best form of pressure is embarrassment. You show the human consequences of an inhumane policy. And by getting more and more people to understand the utter cruelty behind this administration's approach to poverty, you begin building enough outrage that even a tone-deaf administration like Trump's has got to begin to move. And that's the only way we're going to get any progress.
Liz?
Yeah, so, these are small questions. And so I surely don't have answers, but I mean, what I know is that people from the Poor People's Campaign were really excited and honored that I was invited to come here, and they were very pleased by the fact that Philip put this report out that looked at poverty in the U.S. and that talked to poor people in the U.S. And folks sent me with then another task, which is to kind of put together a letter asking the Human Rights Council or some UN body to take more seriously a hearing of poor people in the United States, to keep the pressure up, especially when it's clear that there is a little bit of a conversation right now. I mean, that by exposing some of what's been going on in Lowndes County, like there had to be some action by the attention that's happened because of Philip's report. And so and that's part of a movement strategy. And I really believe that it's not one act or one event or one policy that's going to take to reverse this. I mean, we didn't get to 140 million poor and low-income people overnight. It is surely not going to happen that we get rid of that overnight. But it's only going to happen that we do change the course of history and change the direction that society is going in if people come together and do build the power of people to make our government do what we need to be done, even though they're desirous of saying no to that, right? Because that's only what's ever changed. But right now, we have to build the power of people. And the best counter, I think, to this kind of culture of poverty, blaming people for their problems, is by showing that there are poor people rising up to organize across all the lines that people say you can't organize across. To cross geographical, across racial, across ethnic, across religious lines. That is happening. I'm not saying it's a good idea to happen. It's happening. And so from there, I think there's hope. And that hope is not a hope against a Republican candidate or a Republican president. That's a hope that something different is possible. And
So to pick up that question, maybe you're the third party, the Poor People's Campaign.
right. Well, I do think you need like an independent political motion, right? And I think and at this point, poor people's needs are not being met by either party in our country right now, right? We might be able to get some more concessions sometimes from some people, but we're very clear that we need to end poverty. We need to end systemic racism. We need to end voter suppression. We need to, and how are we going to do that? We have a set of demands. Those demands, are visionary. They're totally within reach. And right now, no political party wants to do those things. But we can build the power of people to change that. I mean, and again, that's in my reading of history, that's when changes happen. And sometimes you have to go to an international arena to get legitimacy, to get attention, and to bring about the fact that we're not alone. It's not a U.S. exceptionalism. It's that we need to unite poor people across the world because we actually have a lot in common. We can learn a lot from social movements and from human rights leaders in different countries across the world. And so to be able to kind of be in Geneva and learning from different, both NGOs and social movements, that's powerful for those of us that have been told our whole lives that we're to blame for the situation we're in.
The last word goes to Philip.
Mainly to contradict your opening comment, Ed. You said this is
going so well.
This is the last stage in a process. I've come to realize that people like me who do human rights reports are actually often like doctoral candidates. Doctoral students sweat for years over a hard thesis. They finally produce it, they put it on the table, and they then walk away from it. They say, I never want to see that again, I'm not going to be promoting it, I'm not going to even revise it into a decent book or whatever, I'm through. And I think that's what we often do with human rights reports. We sweat over them, we finally produce them, and then we walk away. I think what I certainly want to do, and I hope others will, is to see this report as actually the start of a process. And I think the process goes in different directions. I think Liz's movement, I would love to see a stronger rights dimension. I'm not trying to take it over as a human rights thing, but whether it's the campaign for a right to universal health care, which seems to me to be the single most important starting point. If you could do that, you also create rights consciousness. For the human rights movement, I think we need to see the rights in the broader context. We need to bring poverty into it. We need to bring the economics into it. We can't be ignoring fiscal policy and other issues. We need to try to adopt a more sophisticated approach, which also is capable of reaching out to a broader audience, bringing in all of Liz's people, bringing in a lot of other people who are currently disillusioned and say, human rights doesn't have much to offer to us. I think if we demonstrate that it is of direct relevance to those who are being systematically disempowered under the present system, we can reinvigorate the whole exercise. Finally, just to say thank you to Andrew Clapham, who's sitting up there, who was central in helping us to organise this whole exercise. And thanks to you, Ed, and The Guardian particularly.
Thank you very much, and thank you for throwing up great questions and for being great listeners. Thank you for the Graduate Institute for making this happen, and to our brilliant panel. Thank you very much.